What is up, ladies and gentlemen? Welcome back to another episode of Double Move Sports. As always, I am Stef, and I'm here with my best friend Alex. Say what's up to the people.
How's it going, everyone? Hope everyone is having a great week. I personally just got back from the zoo, so I saw all sorts of lions, tigers, and bears out there, but super excited to get into some fantasy football topics today. Never sleeps. We're in the off season right now, but we've got a lot of really good debates that me and Steph are going to go through.
Yeah, guys, I'm hyped for this. We got a lot of good stuff to get into here. You know, I've been quarantining myself the last, couple of days here with some of the coronavirus outbreak. Our hearts go out to everybody affected by this. Please be safe, everyone. But with that said, I think we can jump right into it. And guys, what we're going to be doing today is, just as Alex said, fantasy player debates. So we're going to look at some different players, maybe some names that are very well known that everybody wants to draft, maybe some that are a little bit deeper, and look at some comparisons, whether it's their outlook, some stats and takeaways from 2019 that we can extrapolate onto 2020. But let's start it off here with two big names. First QB off the board, Alex, would you rather have Lamar Jackson or Patrick Mahomes? Lamar Jackson ended as the QB1. Mahomes is the QB8. Missed a couple games. I believe it was 2 games with that knee injury that he suffered against Denver on a Thursday night football game. But who are you taking between those two guys? If you're drafting today in a redraft league and you want to take a quarterback off the board early, which one of those are you taking?
I mean, I might be a little biased here because I'm a huge Lamar Jackson fan, went to school with him back at Louisville, but my guy's Lamar Jackson. He's the reigning MVP. He ran for 1,200 yards in only 15 games last season. As a quarterback, we all know that rushing yards are essentially a cheat code. So with that rushing baseline, if you just took Lamar Jackson's rushing stats from 2019, that was 1,200 yards and 7 touchdowns. That is equal to 4,000 passing yards or 40 passing touchdowns. So take whatever he does through the air, and you're just stacking 4,000 yards or 40 passing touchdowns on top of that. And to me, that just takes him over the top. I know we've got a couple other mobile quarterbacks, like Kyler Murray's talked about a lot. Dak Prescott, I think, finished as the quarterback too. Patrick Mahomes himself is a bit mobile as well, but nothing has ever come close since maybe Michael Vick to what we've seen out of Lamar Jackson. He led the NFL in yards per carry with 6.9 yards per carry. And I think in 2020, he could easily beat that record he set for quarterback rush yards. He only played 15 games this year. And he also sat out the fourth quarter of several blowouts. And then in a lot of those games, even in the third quarter, they were handing it off to Mark Ingram and Gus Edwards a lot of the time because the game was out of hand. So to me, I mean, we could talk about his passing and people say, oh, he's an accurate passer. He can't throw to the numbers or outside the numbers, all those sorts of things. But to me, I mean, 36 passing touchdowns this past season, over 3,000 passing yards. He doesn't have to be a Patrick Mahomes, a Peyton Manning, a Tom Brady, a Dan Marino through the air with what we've seen from his legs. So I do expect that 36 passing touchdown number to come down a bit in 2020. He was very effective with that touchdown rate. But even if he gets around, 25, 30 touchdowns and he's able to up the passing yards number from 3,100 and up those rushing numbers a little bit, which might be asking a lot, but I think he can do it. There's no reason to believe he shouldn't be quarterback 1 in fantasy again in 2020.
Yeah, you bring up some good points, but I'm going to have to disagree with you on this one. I'm taking Mahomes. Hate to go against my boy Lamar, but I have to do it here. Even though Mahomes finished as the QB8, he had a 66% completion percentage, still finished 10th in passing yards, and he had some dud games at some different points this season that were just kind of some weird game scripts where the Chiefs went up big early, didn't really need him to throw a ton. 26-5 touchdown to interception ratio. He also finished 4th in yards per attempt at 8.3. So we look at Lamar Jackson, we look at Patrick Mahomes. These guys are almost on different ends of the spectrum when it comes to, where they make their hay, where their sweet spots are. But you got Mahomes averaging 20.5 fantasy points a game in 2019. You're not going to pass that up. And, yes, the kind of, low-hanging fruit, if we want to go against Lamar Jackson, is, mobile quarterbacks, they're more likely to get more injured. Maybe Lamar's not the biggest guy, but I hate to take this away from Mahomes here, as I'm kind of making an argument for him, but Mahomes has actually been more injury prone and has missed more time than Lamar Jackson has. So you can't really make that argument there. So if we look at that, a lot of people forget that Mahomes has had a pretty high rushing baseline in previous seasons. This was his lowest rushing year out of the 2 full seasons that he's played, with only 218 rushing yards. He had that knee injury that obviously took him out of 2 games, essentially 3 games, because he only threw 11 passes versus Denver. But we saw in the postseason, whether it was against the Titans on one of those huge breakaway runs or in the Super Bowl when he's, taking it in himself in the red zone, Mahomes should also increase his rushing floor as well, which is just going to be even more value getting him as the first QB off the board. Good news in terms of that injury, there's been no structural damage to the knee, so I'm not worried about it long term. He actually went to practice every single day during that injury, so that's not a concern for me. And then you look at Mahomes' weapons. I know Lamar has some great weapons and the offense is built, around his skill set, but same for the Chiefs, right? And then you give him Tyreek Hill, maybe the fastest, most explosive wide receiver or just overall weapon in the entire NFL. You give him give Mahomes the best receiving tight end in the league with Travis Kelce. And you get a little, Super Bowl experience. You got a little bit extra clout now. You say, hey, we've been there. We've done this before. We've been down 3 scores in an AFC championship game and brought it all the way back. I mean, what more can you say about Mahomes? He's a generational talent. I don't think you can pass up on him. And, just like you're saying, right, like Lamar's upside could be higher. I think you can say the same for Mahomes. What's to say he doesn't put up another, 5,000 passing yard, 50 touchdown season like he did in 2018 when he took the league by storm and won MVP. So I'm taking Mahomes on this one. Alex, what are your thoughts here?
Yeah, I mean, one thing I actually had written in my notes was that if Mahomes can throw for 5,000 yards and 40 touchdowns in 2020, which, 5,040, that's something we've seen him do before. We've seen him get the 50, so it's something I actually expect him to do if he stays healthy for the whole season. And if he's able to do it, I expect it to be really close between him and Lamar Jackson. One thing I'm really looking for with the Ravens offense, though, is to get some more weapons around Lamar. When you think about last year, you had Hollywood Brown, who was a rookie, and he was banged up for a lot of the season. Mark Andrews, the tight end, was his best weapon all year long. But outside of that, he's throwing to Miles Boykin and Willie Snead and Chris Moore, and some of these guys are holding it down all right, but if they can bring in another receiver to help out Lamar Jackson, and then Hollywood Brown can stay healthy and continue to take the top off defenses, yeah, he might not be Tyreek Hill, but he's Tyreek Hill light. I think that could really help Lamar Jackson through the air, get some higher passing yards numbers, and allow that offense to be even more dynamic than we saw in 2019. So I love everything you said about Mahomes. He still does have some mobility himself. In the playoffs, we really saw that mobility come to life with his legs. And I think it's going to be close, but I got to still lean with my boy Lamar.
It seems like the experts around the fantasy world are having this debate as well, right? We look at Fantasy Pros ADP right now that was updated on March 13th. We see that Lamar and Mahomes, their best ADP is the first QB off the board. Their worst is both tied at the third QB off the board. So I don't know who's putting either of those guys at third, but it's going to be an interesting one nonetheless. I think it's really pick. We're kind of splitting hairs here. Really, when it comes down to it, both of them are going to be fantastic options. And if you play right in your draft, maybe you land one on your team. But Alex, let's move over to the next debate here with some top-heavy running backs.
Absolutely. So we're going to talk about Christian McCaffrey. It seems like we can't even debate him against anybody because he had such an incredible record-breaking 2019 season. But we're going to debate Christian McCaffrey against Saquon Barkley. And in this debate, I am going to take the side of Saquon Barkley, which I found was very challenging to do when I was doing my research. And you're going to take the side of Christian McCaffrey. So since he is kind of the go-to running back one for 2020, I'm going to let you start it off and tell me why you think Christian McCaffrey should be drafted ahead of Saquon Barkley in 2020.
Yeah, so looking at it right away, you have Christian McCaffrey finishing as the RB1 in PPR leagues last year, Saquon as the RB10. But I have seen a little bit of debate. We do have some Saquon truthers that are out there, so I'm interested to hear what case you can make. But for McCaffrey, him and Saquon both have new head coaches, first-time head coaches in the NFL coming into this season. So, we look ahead, things might be more even than we think. Now, McCaffrey is a pretty easy argument to make. He's coming off the greatest fantasy season of all time. He led the NFL with 2,392 yards from scrimmage in 2019. That's the third most by any player in NFL history. And he essentially finished first or second in every category, statistical category at the RB position, whether it's touchdowns, receptions, snap count, targets, red zone touches, receiving yards. He was third in rushing yards. It's probably his worst stat. Do I think there's going to be regression? Absolutely. But even if there is regression here, you take 35% of McCaffrey's points away, and he's still a top 5 running back. Like, this is unprecedented levels of production that we've seen. Look at guys like LaDainian Tomlinson, who had these massive seasons. McCaffrey for the Panthers, he's the heart and soul of that offense. And, with Matt Rule coming in, I think it's going to remain the same. Matt Rule is a ground and pound run game type of guy. Matt Rule ran the ball on 49% of snaps at Baylor, which would, if that remains constant in the NFL, that would be third in terms of how often they run the ball. So I expect that volume to still be there. I'm not sure in terms of the pass catching out of the backfield, what Matt Rule likes to do there, how that's going to translate from college to the pros. But whatever QB they bring in, or if it's still Cam Newton, McCaffrey is going to be a safety valve for that quarterback, regardless of who it is, especially if it's a rookie that they draft. And then, we look at Saquon here. He was definitely impacted by injury in 2019, but going back to ADP prior to the season, Saquon was actually higher than Christian McCaffrey on most draft boards. So maybe we'll see that 2018 rookie season Saquon make a comeback. So I'm interested to hear what you have to say.
Yeah, first things first. Again, it's really hard to argue against Christian McCaffrey after all the points he just made. This is a tough one for you. But a couple things I will say about CMC that I'm a bit worried about is, if his snap count and his usage stays the same or even similar, even within 5% of what it was last year, he's the clear number one, and I have no argument here. So basically, I just have to assume that snap count and that usage is not going to stay the same. And it's really hard for a running back to play 93% of snaps in a season, and that's what Christian McCaffrey just did. He had more snaps in 2019 than Deshaun Watson, Kyler Murray, Kirk Cousins, wow, Derek Carr, and Lamar Jackson. He played more snaps than all of those quarterbacks. And to do that at the running back position is just unheard of. So I do think his usage and snap count is going to regress a little bit, especially with a new head coach that might not run him into the ground right away. So from the CMC side, he's a super electric player. He's dynamic. He can do it with his legs on the ground. He can do it in the passing game, and he's going to be elite again in 2020, no doubt. But you really have to look over on Saquon's side and say, if it weren't for the injury last season, he could have been very close to Christian McCaffrey. I know he did start a little bit slower, but really what we saw down the stretch was the Saquon Barkley we expected. He finished as the running back 7 in terms of points per game in 2019, and that was after dealing with a high ankle sprain midseason, which we know you don't really come back from those 100% right away. Once he did get back to 100%, that was probably closer to the end of the season. And in weeks 14 through 16, which is the fantasy football playoffs, he was the running back 2 in half PPR. And no, it wasn't number 2 behind Christian McCaffrey. It was number 2 behind Kenyon Drake. McCaffrey was third, though, so I'll give him that. But we saw it in spurts. We've seen it in spurts for Barkley's entire career, and we know that he's just got those tree trunk thighs that are just plowing through defenders. He's making people miss. Yeah, the Saquads. And we've seen his power. We've seen him in the passing game be effective. He averaged 4 receptions a game in 2019, which provides a really nice baseline in half PPR or PPR formats. In 2018, in his rookie year, he actually averaged closer to 6 receptions a game. So even looking at the 2019 season, there's a chance for him to get more involved in the passing game in 2020. And last year, he only ran for 6 touchdowns. The Giants' offense was a bit dysfunctional last season. They were making that transition from Eli Manning to Daniel Jones. Daniel Jones had a couple really awesome games mixed in there, but there was a lot of inconsistency with Daniel Jones having a year under his belt, stepping into year 2, having a new head coach in Joe Judge. I think that offense should take a big step forward, and I think that 6 rushing touchdown number for Saquon will go up in 2020. I wouldn't be surprised to see him in the double digits. So with Saquon, with McCaffrey, it's kind of going with what we've seen, and with Saquon, it's kind of going with what we expect to see, which is a lot of times a little bit harder to swallow. But just taking Saquon's rookie season and then the flashes he showed last year, if he's able to piece that dynamic playmaking ability together for an entire season and he can stay healthy and that Giants offense can be effective, there's no reason to believe that Saquon and his talent and his skill set shouldn't be right up there with Christian McCaffrey and shouldn't be right up there in terms of fantasy points per game. Steph, what do you think about my argument? It was tough.
Yeah, I know we put you in a tough spot there. The biggest takeaway for me in terms of Saquon is the reception volume. He went from 91 receptions in 2018 to 52 over the course of the entire 2019 season. Yes, he missed 3 games, but still, that's a pretty large disparity. And I think it's just because Daniel Jones is not a check down guy. He wants to chuck it deep every chance that he can.
It's true.
I think that's why a lot of people think the Giants offense is going to take a huge turnaround. I'm kind of on the fence. I'm curious, Alex, what do you think? I'm going to put you on the spot here again. In terms of potential range of outcomes, which offense do you think has more? Is it the Giants or is it going to be the Panthers?
That is a super tough question because they're honestly both in similar situations. Compared to 2019, they're going to have, with the Panthers, they're going to have a step up at quarterback. And that step up is going to be, whether it's Cam Newton or somebody else, that's going to be better than Kyle Allen was. So you expect that alone is going to improve that offense. On the Giants side, it's going to be the same guy, but you expect that level up in the offense to just come from maturity and development from Daniel Jones. So from a range of outcomes perspective, I think it's got to be right now it's got to be the Panthers just because we don't know who that quarterback is going to be. But if it is Cam Newton, then I have to say it's the Giants. Daniel Jones led the league in fumbles last season. His interception numbers weren't awful, but he was just a turnover machine. And if Daniel Jones comes in and lights the world on fire, they could be a top offense. I know it sounds crazy to say, but if that O-line can be shored up a little bit, they've got Sterling Shepard coming back healthy. Slayton is going to be in year 2, taking another step forward. Evan Ingram healthy. Golden Tate. Saquon's healthy. And then a new head coach in Daniel Jones in year 2. That's a really good nucleus, and that's a high potential offense, but I could also see the wheels kind of falling off. So for me, there is some variance with the Giants, but just because we know who the group is going to be, it's a little bit more stable. And with the Panthers, we don't really know what's going to happen there, especially at the quarterback position. Greg Olsen is now gone. Like we talked about, I don't know if McCaffrey's usage is going to be quite the same. I don't know if they'll bring in a guy that maybe takes 10-15% of snaps, God forbid, to try to give him a break. They do have the 2 young receivers in DJ Moore and Curtis Samuel that I expect to continue to take strides forward, but I think the Panthers, just due to the quarterback, it could go either way.
Yeah, I'm going to say the upside, and maybe that was a trick question there because range of outcomes also, entails a lot of positive. I think the range of outcomes is higher for the Giants, but in a positive way. It's like, I could see them being a sneaky wild card team in the NFC East. They're, in a pretty, relatively soft division compared to other ones that are out there. We saw, right, like the Cowboys and the Eagles are making it in the last couple of years from that division with nothing to write home about in terms of their win-loss category. So, could see the Giants, have a, huge explosive blow up. There's upside there, just like you said. At the same point, though, we could see maybe Danny Dimes is throwing, 30 interceptions, Jameis Winston style. One more thing I want to throw out there, and this is just a little, conspiracy theory, but if it happens, I want it to be on record. Potentially, the Carolina Panthers, you may hate me for saying this, they may roll out a out of his prime Cam Newton this year with, subtle desires to tank and tank specifically for Trevor Lawrence, who's also, has a huge impact in that Carolina fan base. I think there'd be no question they're selling out every single game. As from just kind of a sports marketing standpoint, I think it would make sense for the Panthers to do everything they can to get Trevor Lawrence. Maybe that has some trickle-down effect. I know this is a reach here, but maybe we could see that come into play for McCaffrey, and that offense just kind of stalls out. They're like, hey, let's not win this game because we want to get Trevor Lawrence. But that was the last one I wanted to throw out there. Anything else before we move on to the next one here?
Well, if they're trying to tank, they need to move on from Cam Newton, because Cam Newton's going to be able to get them 6-7 wins, you would think, minimum. If they want to tank, they should try to flip him for Mitch Trubisky or something and try out experiment.
Why are we so mean to Mitch Trubisky on this show?
He's done nothing wrong except be a bad quarterback.
Everything.
Oh, man. Yeah, that's all I got, though. Right. I think really good debate there. If you end up with Christian McCaffrey or Saquon Barkley, you should be thrilled with either one. But maybe a lot of these moves as we get closer to the season, especially with the Cam Newton situation, will give us a little bit more clarity. So let's go ahead and move on to the next topic.
So let's move over to two rookies in 2019 that are in some pretty interesting situations, whether it was splitting carries, dealing with injury at different points. It's Miles Sanders, the RB15 in PPR leagues, or Devin Singletary, who finishes the RB32. That's the Buffalo Bills running back. He finished 32 in PPR scoring. And just as a caveat, guys, just so you know, everything that we're talking about here is PPR scoring. We're just PPR guys. That's what we like to play. But of those two, I have to take Miles Sanders, running back for the Philadelphia Eagles. He was an absolute monster down the stretch after Jordan Howard went out. He had 21 points on the road against Miami in Week 13. He had 35 points against Washington in Week 15. He had 26 points versus Dallas in Week 16. So certainly if you're a fantasy owner who had your hands on Sanders in the fantasy playoffs, you're going to try to get your hands on him again, and for good reason. He played really well when given a larger workload, and I expect the Eagles coaching staff, even though they do heavily favor a running back by committee approach and splitting carries. I remember last year we had names like Darren Sproles still getting touches for them. I expect Doug Peterson and his staff to look back at the tape and see, look, Miles Sanders is one of our best playmakers. He's an explosive threat, whether it's checkdowns out of the backfield, giving him the ball up the middle, you name it. He is a absolute beast, and I can't wait to watch what he's going to do in 2020. But I got to think Doug Peterson's going to look back and say, hey, we got to get Sanders the ball in space. We have to get the ball into the hands of our playmakers. He's shown great receiving chops in a check-down heavy offense. The Eagles run the ball 7th most in the NFL, and Miles Sanders had 50 receptions, which puts him at 12th amongst all running backs in 2019. Another interesting stat that I found on him, and this is absolutely reflected when you watch him on Sundays, is Sanders has a 32% juke rate, which is 5th amongst all running backs. And what that number comes from, what that juke rate means, it's the total number of evaded tackles divided by total number of touches. So Sanders is in the top end of that. And one of the biggest things that we look at for potential fantasy value is, can defenders bring this guy down? And for Sanders, they cannot. Nobody wants to tackle him. So I'm taking him here. I think he's going to be an absolute beast in 2020, and I'm taking him over Singletary. Alex, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, Miles Sanders is a guy I really like for 2020. I think, he's a very talented player, and he's going to take another step up in 2020 as a running back. Weeks 11 through 16 in 2019, he was actually the running back 6 in PPR points per game. So to me, he did show some workhorse potential, both on the ground and in the passing game through the air. But to me, I just think Doug Peterson is going to continue to roll with that running back by committee strategy that he has always used. And I think Miles Sanders is going to see some of his upside limited because of that. We saw Jordan Howard this past season have over 500 yards on the ground and 6 rushing touchdowns. And that's after missing the last several games of the season. We even saw Boston Scott come in and have 250 rushing yards and 5 touchdowns because Doug Peterson, again, didn't want to roll out just one guy 100% of the time. So Jordan Howard is a free agent. I think it's going to be really interesting to see in this offseason whether they decide to bring in another running back in free agency or in the draft if they spend draft capital on a running back. Those are going to be some things to look out for, because if they do bring in a guy in the draft or in free agency, that's where you maybe take a step back on Miles Sanders. But if they don't bring in a significant amount of help, that's where you have to look at Miles Sanders and say, wow, he could actually be a star in 2020. So definitely look out for those things. But I personally do think they're going to bring in a guy to give him some relief and give him some rest over the course of the season. So kind of moving on to my guy, Devin Singletary. He's such an electric player. He was a third-round draft pick out of Florida Atlantic, and we saw him kind of get a slow start being ramped up in the NFL. Over the first 4 games of the season, he only had 5 carries a game. Over the last 8 games, he had 16 carries a game. So he only played 12 games in his rookie year due to injury, but he had 775 rushing yards. That's on 151 carries. That's 5.1 yards per carry. That is 4th in the entire NFL. In terms of yards per carry, efficiency on the ground. He should see much more carries in 2020 if he can continue to get closer to that 16 carries a game we saw over his last 8. Frank Gore should be gone next season. That should open up some opportunities close to the goal line and also in short yardage situations. And also, he did only have the 2 rushing touchdowns in 2019, but Josh Allen had 9 rushing touchdowns. He was actually top 10 in the NFL in rushing touchdowns. So you've got to think that while Josh Allen is a great mobile quarterback, he's a great QB sneak guy, he's going to have several rushing touchdowns each season. 9 seems a bit high. I think it would be very realistic to say a couple of those go to Singletary in 2020. And then the last thing on Singletary is his efficiency as a receiver. He only saw 2.5 receptions a game in 2019. A lot of that was because he was a rookie. We saw him slowly getting worked into the offense. But the biggest case for this is that playoff game against Houston. It's win or go home. And it seemed like the only thing the Bills could get going on offense was putting the ball in Devin's hands. He had 6 catches for 76 yards in that game. And I think there's a really good chance that Singletary could see 50-plus receptions in 2020, which would be a huge step forward from where he is now. So I think the Buffalo Bills do bring in some sort of help on the ground. Singletary is not really a workhorse type running back as far as his build and his size and his stature goes. But I think a guy like a Gus Edwards could make a lot of sense. Maybe Peyton Barber, they kick the tires with him. Someone in short yardage situations that can help, can give Devin Singletary a break at different times. But I think, the sky's the limit for Devin Singletary. We've seen him break off a lot of big plays already in his NFL career. And I think both of these guys actually have a lot of potential, but I just love Singletary's electric play style and his playmaking ability a little bit more than Miles Sanders at this point. But again, it's all going to come down to what they do in the offseason and what that running back room looks like heading into 2020.
Yeah, both of these backfields have some turnover and some question marks that they're going to have to address. It'd be pretty funny if we see Jordan Howard go from the Eagles to the Bills, which I like as one of the landing spots for him. But where Singletary loses a little bit compared to Sanders for me is just the pass catching work. On the ground, Singletary's putting up 5.1 yards per attempt. Like you said, that's top tier yards per carry numbers. Sanders isn't too far from that though. Where Singletary's like 6, I think Sanders is like 16 at 4.6 yards per carry. And Sanders did have 28 more carries than Singletary this season, but it just feels like to me that Singletary's baseline in this offense is somewhere around 8 to 10 points, where I feel like Sanders is a little bit higher than that. And for Singletary, he's really hard to predict based on the matchups that he was seeing. He put up stinkers against Miami twice, and then he had big games versus Dallas and Baltimore, which were 2 of the top rushing defenses. It just seems like, at least for right now, in terms of his passing work, Devin Singletary is very game script dependent. The Bills don't really pass it out of the backfield too often. It really only is reserved for when they're down late in games and have to make big comebacks. And we just weren't able to see a consistent full workload for Devin Singletary, even on an offense that runs the ball 7th most in the league. But certainly, as the season went on, he was continuing to progress. If they don't bring anybody in and Singletary is the full workhorse back for Buffalo, then I love him. He should be a low-end RB1, to be honest with you, especially if he scores a little bit more. But for me, I'm taking Sanders just off of his pass catching work. Maybe we're splitting hairs here versus PPR versus standard. But for a guy that was on the field for 70% of snaps for the Bills, which would be 10th amongst our running backs, Singletary still finished as, an RB3. So I don't love him. I'm taking Sanders over him, but certainly both guys you can make a case for. Now let's switch over here to two breakout stars, two emerging wide receivers in Michael Gallup and Calvin Ridley. Gallup finished as the wide receiver 22 in PPR leagues. Calvin Ridley as the wide receiver 27, so pretty similar there. Alex, I'll have you go ahead and make your case first. Who do you like out of these two guys?
Yeah, I really like Calvin Ridley a lot. Again, these are both great guys to look at for 2020. We saw them both take another really strong step forward in 2019. But to me, it's Calvin Ridley. He's put together 2 awesome seasons in the NFL already. He was a first-round pick back in 2018. You have to respect that draft capital. And last season, he was wide receiver 18 in terms of points per game. So he's already, a mid-wide receiver too. And that's as the second receiver on his own team. And with the Falcons, there's just a lot of stability within that team. You know that Julio Jones is going to be back. You know Calvin Ridley is going to be back. You know Matt Ryan's going to be the quarterback. So not a lot is changing. Where right now with the Cowboys, there's a lot up in the air. Is Amari Cooper going to be there? Is Dak going to get the long-term deal? Some things like that. And once that shakes out, those concerns go away. But there is a new head coach in Mike McCarthy, so you just have to wonder how that's going to work out as well. So again, going back to Calvin Ridley, 7 targets a game in 2019. And the really interesting thing that I want to look at is what Calvin Ridley was able to do after the Falcons traded Mohamed Sanu. He was having a fine season before Sanu was traded to the Patriots, but when Sanu got traded, he played 4 games with Matt Ryan for the rest of the 2019 season. And in those 4 games, Calvin Ridley averaged 21.5 PPR points per game. Just for some context, only one player in the NFL averaged more than 21.5 PPR points a game, and that was Michael Thomas. So we saw the upside with that offense when Matt Ryan is looking exclusively at Julio Jones and Calvin Ridley. And I know Austin Hooper was a bit banged up in there as well, but this is an offense that can support 2 really elite wide receivers. And Ridley's emergence is only going to help Julio Jones, and Julio Jones drawing coverage is only going to help Calvin Ridley. And a really interesting stat that Football Outsiders puts together is called the DVOA, and that stands for the defense adjusted value over average. And I know that's a mouthful, but basically what that means is this metric, it measures the value per play that a receiver gives you over an average wide receiver. So after calculating every snap in 2019, they gave Calvin Ridley the number 2 DVOA for the entire season, behind only Chris Godwin. So what's that saying is on when he was targeted, on when he made catches, on when he was just running routes, he was the number 2 as far as value over average, according to this statistic. So I know it's just one statistic that Football Outsiders probably made up, but it's really interesting to see that this guy is he's doing the right things. Like, he is putting himself in good situations. He's running strong routes. He's making plays when he's thrown to. He's not dropping the ball. He's making yards after catch. He's scoring touchdowns, things like that. So it just tells you that stats don't always tell the whole story. And luckily with Calvin Ridley, we get a really strong story from the stats, but we also get a really strong story from just his ability as a wide receiver. So heading into 2020, I think that Calvin Ridley and Julio Jones could be the next Mike Evans, Chris Godwin type situation where maybe they go back and forth week to week on who's going to have the massive blow-up week, but this offense can definitely support both as elite wide receiver ones in fantasy football.
There's some hot takes baked in there. I don't necessarily disagree. I do love Calvin Ridley, but let me throw some points out there as to why I'm way more hyped up about Gallup as opposed to Ridley. Really the question for me comes down to the passing volume. I think there's going to be a lot of regression in that category for the Falcons. They passed more in 2019 than any other team in the NFL. So I feel like we've kind of seen Ridley's volume or ceiling, I should say, from a volume standpoint. He finished 35th amongst targets among all wide receivers. He was great in games without Sanu. Don't want to take anything away from him there, but if he's going to be the new Mohamed Sanu, I don't want him, right? Like, Sanu is a mediocre streamer. You never really knew when to start him. You could play him in some matchups, but there was still some question as to is he going to be the guy this week? And I'm not drafting that by choice in my redraft leagues. While I do think there is going to be plenty of volume there, next year. The game scripts also helped, as part of that volume, right? The Falcons had a terrible defense. They had so many injuries on their defense. And so we see Matt Ryan coming out, slinging it with a crazy amount of attempts, giving the ball to everybody, right? We saw Russell Gage have some great games. We saw, that Austin Hooper, stretch there where he was putting up a touchdown a game, playing really, really well for them. So you take some of that into effect. I do think the volume may be a bit lower, but certainly with, some of those pieces, turnover at the running back position, potentially turnover at the tight end position with Hooper walking in free agency. I do think, Ridley will still make his hay and be a fine guy, but I'm really excited about this guy, Michael Gallup. I think he's going to be an absolute beast. He had, 1,100 receiving yards in 2019. He was 10th in yards per reception amongst all wide receivers at 16.8. He had 6 touchdowns this year and had the 23 most targets amongst all wide receivers. He's a major part of that Cowboys passing game. He's an explosive playmaker. And if you pair him with Amari Cooper, even better. If not, I actually love Michael Gallup even more if he has to become the de facto number 1 for the Cowboys with Cooper hitting the open market. Dak is coming off the best passing season of his career. I expect him to continue to play at the level that he has played. He's been a QB1 every single year, and now we're seeing him do it really all with his arm, not too much with his legs. And, yes, Gallup may have burned you, fantasy owners, in the playoff stretch. He had a rough stretch of games there from like week 13 to the end of the year, but it's the Cowboys. We should have seen that coming, right? We know they're going to choke down the stretch and find a way to lose that NFC East title. But with the Cowboys letting Byron Jones and Michael Bennett potentially walk in free agency, I think their defense could take a step down, which will lead to better game scripts for Gallup. And Gallup's only 24 years old, so still plenty of time ahead of him. His prime years have yet to come. I'm really excited about what he can do, especially if that Cowboys offense continues to improve with some new coaching and things like that. Alex, what are your takes on Gallup?
Yeah, there's a lot to break down based on what you just said, but it's too bad that most fantasy leagues don't go into week 17, because I know you mentioned Gallup struggling down the stretch. He had that breakout 3-touchdown game in week 17 last season, but yeah, I think Gallup's a great player. I think there's a really good chance he could step up and have an even bigger 2020. But there's, to me, just too many question marks. We saw a similar type situation in Pittsburgh last year. Antonio Brown leaves, and we're thinking, Juju's going to be a star. And yeah, Ben Roethlisberger wasn't there. They were playing Duck Hodges and Mason Rudolph, and we all know how that went. So maybe we'll give Juju the benefit of the doubt and give him one more season as far as stepping up and being that number 1. But with Michael Gallup, we just don't know. If Amari Cooper leaves, it's like, can Gallup be the guy when everyone's focused on him? And if Amari Cooper stays, then it's back to the situation of, can this offense support 2 really elite wide receivers? So, there's a chance that Gallup could be that, but to me, there's just a lot of question marks around it that we don't really have the answers to, and I don't want to take that kind of risk when I know I could get Calvin Ridley and know exactly what I'm getting. And then again, you did mention Dak Prescott taking a lot of strides forward as far as his passing volume goes in 2019. And there's 2 sides of the coin there, though. You could say, he passed for 4,900 yards and 30 touchdowns, and that's the new normal for Dak Prescott. Or you could compare it to the first 3 seasons of his career, where he beat his career high in passing yards by 1,000 yards. He beat his career high in passing touchdowns by 7. And you could say maybe this was a bit of an outlier, and Dak Prescott's not going to throw for 5,000 yards and 30 touchdowns every season. That's actually more like 3,500 yards and 25 touchdowns. So just from a volume standpoint, I don't know that this Cowboys offense is going to sustain that kind of passing volume again in 2020, especially when we know the kind of volume that Zeke eats up on the ground. So To me, again, I think Gallup's a great player. He was a third-round pick in 2018. He's shown a lot. We did a highlight video on him, and I was able to break down a lot of his film. And wow, he is awesome, and he's a deep threat.
He's a beast.
He had that really high yards per catch number. So I think he brings a lot to the table. I think he's a strong wide receiver too in fantasy for 2020. But if you're giving me the choice between Gallup and Ridley, I think Ridley's floor is higher, and I think his ceiling is a little bit higher as well. Moving forward. So there's a lot there. I think, the Cowboys offense could change a lot. Mike McCarthy, we all know what he did in Green Bay and how effective those offenses were through the air. So we'll see. We will see. But to me, Ridley is my guy here, and that's who I want in 2020.
So, Alex, take us into the next one here, breaking down some maybe some bigger name wide receivers.
Yeah, so we're actually going to stay with the Atlanta Falcons wide receiver group, and we are going to take Julio Jones up against Davante Adams, both elite wide receiver ones in fantasy football for a big piece of their career. I'm going to take the Julio Jones side here. Steph, I know you're a big Davante Adams fan. I'll let you start it off this time. You tell me why you would rather have Davante Adams over Julio Jones in 2020.
My keeper, Davante Adams. I know he finished as the wide receiver 23. He missed 4 weeks with injury, though, so we got to keep some of that, in mind when we're looking at some of these season-long stats. He averaged 17.6 fantasy points per game in standard leagues, which is 6th amongst all wide receivers. What I love about Adams is his target share in that offense. He pretty much is the Green Bay passing attack. We saw that late in the postseason when Green Bay played Seattle. They were just force-feeding Adams, and Rodgers was able to get it to him at will. Had an absolute fantastic game there. He finished 14th with 4 games missed amongst all wide receivers and targets. So still, top-tier level production and target share. Consistently a scoring threat from 2016 to 2018. No one had more touchdown receptions than Adams, outside of Antonio Brown, who was putting up historical level stats there and was like the clear number one. Adams was right behind him. He finished 3rd in red zone receptions in 2019, and in 2018 he was number 1. So you have to think if Adams is healthy for a full 16-game season, he's going to be that number 1 spot. He dominated when he was healthy in 2019. There were questions towards the beginning of the season with new head coach Matt LaFleur. He's going to bring in a Shanahan-style offensive scheme to the Packers, and that passing volume is going to get diminished a little bit. And we did see some of that. But towards the end of the season, that was not a concern for Adams at all. Rodgers targets him a ton. We have Jimmy Graham, who just got released by the Packers. Geronimo Allison's a free agent. Alan Lazard is a free agent. So I'm not sure what's going to happen there with some of the other weapons. If they do bring in one of the names that's been mentioned for the Packers would be Austin Hooper, whether it's him or some other receiving help. To me, I don't see that as a negative for Adams. I see that as just, hey, the offense is going to get better. They're going to be on schedule more often. They're going to be able to push the ball downfield, which just means more touchdowns for Davante Adams. Look at these scores from week 10 on in PPR for Adams. He finished with 18 points, 19 points, 24 points. He had an 8-point game in there and then went right back up, 23, 22, 22 again. That's what you're getting out of Davante Adams. So I'm a huge Adams truther. He might even be my wide receiver 2 for the 2020 season. I'm absolutely all in on him, especially when compared to Julio Jones. But Alex, what's your thought on my Adams takes?
Yeah, he's an elite talent. I love the talent. I think he is a wide receiver 1 in fantasy football in 2020. He's a top 8, top 10 guy for me. There's one game in 2019 that specifically stands out. I think they were playing the Philadelphia Eagles, and he just absolutely roasted them for 20 yards every time Aaron Rodgers threw him the ball. So he's a guy we know can just absolutely eat on the outside, but something that you have to remember with Davante Adams, he's only been over 1,000 receiving yards one time in his 6-year NFL career. One time. And his best seasons from a fantasy perspective were from 2016 through 2018, and they were very touchdown dependent. 12 touchdowns, 10 touchdowns, and 13 touchdowns. And yeah, he's a big red zone threat, but you see what Matt LaFleur is doing with this offense. They seemed very committed to the run, especially inside the 5 and 10 yard line. In 2019, they didn't throw the ball a lot inside that tight of a space. And you could look at that on both sides of the coin and say, okay, maybe that's going to regress positively for Adams, and maybe they'll throw it a little bit more close to the goal line in 2020, and that's where we know that Davante Adams lives. But maybe that's just a Matt LaFleur thing, and he likes to pound the rock into the end zone. So that's something that you just got to keep in mind with Adams. And I think he's an elite receiver, but to me, I'm going with the guy who has gotten it done year in and year out, and you always know he's going to be a top receiver in the league, no questions asked, a top fantasy option. And that is Julio Jones. He was second in the NFL in receiving yards last year in just 15 games. And there's some really interesting stats I was able to find on Julio and just what he's been able to do over the past 6 seasons. He is one of the hands down best receivers of our generation. If you take his worst season in each stat category over the past 6 seasons, it's 83 receptions is his low in receptions. 1,394 yards is his lowest yardage output, and 3 touchdowns. If you take his lowest season in each category, he would have been wide receiver 12 this year in fantasy football.
Wow.
And over the last 6 years in PPR, he's been wide receiver 3, wide receiver 7, wide receiver 7, wide receiver 8, wide receiver 1, and wide receiver 6. So, again, it's like Julio's done it 6 years in a row. That's pretty much guaranteeing a top 8 wide receiver with the upside of a wide receiver 1, of the wide receiver 1 in fantasy football. The offense should remain constant in 2020. We know Matt Ryan's going to be the quarterback. Calvin Ridley's emerging on the other side of the ball, which I don't really think takes away from Julio. We saw Julio be really successful back in the day when Roddy White was there. Roddy White kind of passed the torch over to Julio Jones. And I think Ridley's breakout could actually help this Falcons offense as a whole. If we see 6 to 8 touchdowns have been the big thing with Julio Jones, which is kind of the least sticky stat for a wide receiver. That's been his biggest issue. And if we can see 6 to 8 touchdowns from Julio this year, that's a lock for a top 5 performance if he stays healthy at the wide receiver position. If he somehow gets 10 touchdowns in a season, that's when you're looking at Julio Jones and saying, like, he's a wide receiver 1 or wide receiver 2. So for me, Julio is just so safe as a top 8 guy as long as he stays healthy. And then you throw in the potential for a big year in the touchdown category, and like your upside is literally wide receiver 1. So I'm going with the guy who's done it before. I hate taking away from Adams and his talent, but there is no way, even though he's a little bit older now, I think he's into his 30s, but Julio Jones is a lock as a wide receiver 1 this season as long as he stays healthy. So give me that all day long.
It's tough, for me to take Julio over Adams with just kind of the way that we've seen the Falcons offense struggle at different times. Even in, the year they made it to the Super Bowl, like we would just see them stall out. And then you look at age, right? Adams is 27, right there in his prime. Julio is 31, aging out. We're seeing him get kind of that ceiling where we see guys start to diminish a little bit. And I just feel like the Falcons haven't figured out a way to fully use Julio in the red zone to this day. This has been like a 5 or 6 year process.
The thing is,
trying to get this man touchdown.
If they haven't figured it out and he's still wide receiver 8 or better the last 6 seasons, that's only good news because there's nowhere to go but up.
That's fair. I mean, you look at 6 touchdowns. Adams had 5 in 3 less games. And so these guys are honestly on just different ends of the coin. What do you value more? Do you value yards and more, ways that Julio could just take over a game? We've seen him put up, games with over 200 receiving yards. Or do you want Adams who could have, 3 touchdowns on a blow-up day? We are really just splitting hairs here, but 6 touchdowns for Julio. I mean, that's the same with the guys like Brashad Perriman had 6 touchdowns this year. Cole Beasley had 6 touchdowns this year. Adams is putting up double-digit touchdowns year in, year out. I absolutely love it. And you're right. Maybe the volume does come down a little bit with LaFleur. I just think what we saw, we have a large enough sample size now with LaFleur to say, oh, those touchdowns aren't just going to disappear. I lock him in for 8 to 12 touchdowns in 2020. But, yeah, this is one that it could go either way. And we put out a poll on Twitter. Shout out to everybody who's following us on Twitter at Double Move Sports. We put out a poll with some dynasty and redraft questions about these two guys, and it was pretty even across the board. You had your Julio truthers, you had your Adams truthers, you had everybody in the middle. So this is a fun one to debate. I'd love to keep this one going. Maybe we'll have to bring this one up again closer to draft season.
So to close out, we've recapped a lot of these debates on a lot of top talent. A lot of them are really tough arguments. But to close out, Steph and I are just going to give one quarterback sleeper for 2020. Over the past 2 seasons, 2 years ago, if you drafted Patrick Mahomes late, you probably won your fantasy championship or made a pretty deep run. This past year, it was Lamar Jackson. If you scooped him up in the mid to late rounds, you probably were making the playoffs. You probably were making a really deep run. So this year, quarterback is always that position that's like if you can hit on your quarterback late in the draft and get the value at running back and receiver early, that's what can really set you apart in your fantasy football league. So Steph and I are going to give one early quarterback sleeper for 2020. This is the guy that you should be able to draft in the double-digit rounds that could make the difference in getting you to the playoffs or winning you a championship. Steph, I'm going to let you start it off. Who is one quarterback sleeper who has got some insane upside for the 2020 season?
Yeah, when you can take some dart throws late in a draft and you might be potentially coming away with, a top 5 quarterback, it's huge. Now, these are also names, though, if they come out and put up stinkers to start the year, maybe first 3 or 4 weeks, we're just not seeing what we expected or the upside just isn't there, then by all means just drop them and they can be a streamer on waivers. Maybe you grab them later. But for me, it's Denver Broncos' Drew Lock. He only had 5 starts in 2019, and they went 4-1 in those games. John Elway's already come out and said, no question, that Drew Lock is the guy in Denver right now. And his 64% completion rate was better than any of his completion rates in college. So to me, that says, look, this guy is improving. He's understanding the game better, especially at the pro level. He had one bad game where he had like 8 fantasy points, and that was the snow game where there was an absolute blizzard, like 4 feet of snow. Like guys can't even see because their helmets are just full of snow in Kansas City. That was on the road in Kansas City as well, so you add that in there too. It was just brutal. So I'm not going to read into that game too much. And I have confidence that the Broncos offense will improve. A lot of guys in the fantasy community, I think Alex and myself included, love Noah Fant as a tight end this year that we can grab a little bit later, who could have kind of that Mark Andrews blow up that we saw last season and even in 2018, right? It was George Kittle, or 2017, sorry. It was George Kittle, one that's just, here's a guy on the edge. He's showing some promise. He's a season away from being an absolute breakout. And we know that tight ends typically take some time to get going. We don't see rookie tight ends really produce at crazy levels. So for me, Fant is what I'm definitely circling. So add in some more weapons there. We all love Cortland Sutton. We think he's a beast. Trying to get hands on him everywhere we can, especially in Dynasty. But if you're going to take a second tight end or a defense or a kicker in a draft, why not burn a spot and find out if you have the next breakout quarterback in Drew Lock? Who knows, man? There's so much upside in the unknown. That's really one of the premier mottos that I've taken into fantasy that has helped me time and time again. There is upside in the unknown. Worst case scenario with Drew Lock, you drop him. But best case scenario, man, maybe we're talking about him as a top 5 quarterback next season. I love him as a dart throw late. But Alex, who do you have as a QB sleeper in 2020?
Yeah, Steph, I love it. And honestly, a good draft strategy could be to snag maybe my guy in the 10th round and then Drew Lock in the 12th round and hold him for 4 weeks, see what you got. Maybe you cut them if they suck. If they show some flashes, maybe you hang on to him as a streamer and go from there. And the guy I'm gonna bring up is Daniel Jones. Daniel Jones finished as the QB 24 in 2019. He was the QB 15, though, in terms of points per game as a rookie. And in just 12 games, he had 3,000 passing yards and 24 touchdowns. That 16-game pace is 4,000 yards and 32 passing touchdowns. If Daniel Jones goes out in his rookie year and throws 4,000 yards and 32 touchdowns, we're talking about him as like a top 6, top 7 quarterback next year. And right now, that's just not happening. And another really interesting thing about Daniel Jones, he actually provided a really high rushing baseline, which I'm almost laughing a little bit because it was so shocking. He had 279 rushing yards and 2 rushing touchdowns in 2019. That was more rushing yards per game than Russell Wilson or Dak Prescott, which is like unreal for me to think about. He did have the fumbling problem. He led the NFL in fumbles. He needs to clean that up. He needs to be, less turnover prone. But you got to think, if he is able to clean up some of those turnovers, the Giants are just going to be that much better of an offense. They do have the new coach in Joe Judge, and a lot of those weapons are going to be healthy now. You got Saquon Barkley back and healthy. The receiving corps, Golden Tate, Sterling Shepard, Darius Slayton coming into year 2 looking strong, and his rookie season should all be healthy. So, I mean, Evan Ingram at tight end.
Evan Ingram, yeah.
Is going to be healthy. So if they can keep that weapon group together, that could help Daniel Jones a ton. He was throwing to Rhett Ellison at times last season. That was brutal. So, you know, Daniel Jones, he showed a lot of flashes in his rookie season. He actually showed some weeks of extremely high upside. He finished as the QB2 on the week twice, in week 3 and week 10, and he finished as the QB1 on the week twice, in week 8 and then in championship week 16. So 4 of his 12 starts, he literally was a top 2 quarterback. And if you just think if the wheels don't come off, and a lot of the other starts he was okay, but if the wheels just don't totally come off in those other 8 starts, like if you're 25% of your weeks, you're putting up a QB1 or QB2 performance, that's all you can ask for if he can be consistent over the rest of the season. So we've seen the upside. He has the absolute ability to win you your week when he is hot. And I just don't know why you wouldn't take a dart throw on Daniel Jones late. I mean, I imagine in this year's drafts, if you're taking Drew Lock and Daniel Jones late, I think one of the two for sure pans out, or at least turns into a strong streamer. Maybe you can pair them with another guy and kind of go back and forth depending on matchup. But that late quarterback strategy is just so important to setting you apart in fantasy football. And these are two guys where there's still, I mean, we saw a lot more out of Daniel Jones last season than we did out of Drew Lock as far as a sample size, but there's still so much value in the unknown. New head coach, only his second year in the NFL. There's just so much upside here. So I love the Drew Lock pick. I'm really also excited about Daniel Jones, and you got to scoop him up in round 10 or 11. You got to.
Yeah, I love it. I do. I really do. I think, like, you know, you look at your quarterback position, right? Can you get a guy that's maybe a little bit more stalwart and proven, and then pair it with one of these, you know, high upside young guys? Yes. So look at, you know, Matt Stafford or Matt Ryan or Ben Roethlisberger, and then pair them with a deep shot that could pay off. I love that approach in this year's draft. And man, you got me pretty excited about Daniel Jones now. I remember his kind of, you know, coming of age game where it's coming down to the wire at Tampa Bay on the road in the rain, and it's, you know, clock running down, and he takes his, you know, 5-step drop back. They're sending everybody deep. He sees an opening middle of the field and just takes off on his own. So you're talking about that rushing, you know, and he gets the touchdown on that play. So you're talking about his rushing ability. That's something, too, that could be very sneaky for fantasy. If he has a nice rushing floor, which a lot of people don't talk about or really think of, they kind of see him as like kind of like Jameis Winston, right? Like just a gunslinger who's going to take these 50-50 shots. I could absolutely see Daniel Jones being the next guy that we're talking about as a QB1. But Alex, any other topics, any other names that you want to bring up, any other points that you want to make before we sign off here?
That's all I got today, man. Like, we just went in on a lot of these guys. It was a lot of fun. If there's any other guys you want to see us break down, guys you want to see Stef and I debate, any questions you have, drop them in the comments. Drop them on our Twitter. Drop them on our Instagram. Yes. Twitter's Double Move Sport. Instagram is Double Move Sports. Let us know, and we'd love to break those down in the next episode.
I saw while we were recording here, I put out a tweet before we started. We've already got some new debates coming up. We got Kelsey versus Kittle. We got Joe Mixon versus Nick Chubb. Those will be pretty fun to dive into. Really looking forward to doing more of these type of shows and you know, really nailing down this format into something that's digestible and really fun to watch. It really makes us have to dive deeper into the numbers and, you know, some of the outlook for all these players. Before we go, guys, like Alex said, follow us on Twitter, follow us on Instagram, on YouTube at Double Move Sports there. You can also take the show with you in audio form on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. But thank you all so much for listening. Thank you all so much for watching. Really appreciate it, and we'll see you next time.